Hi, everyone. It's Mike Smith here. We're going to wait just a minute or two to let people join us. Okay, so we're about 3 minutes past the hour here. I think if people are going to join us, they already have. So we have that. Just a couple notes of housekeeping here. If you have any questions, especially with a small crowd, you can go ahead and just shout them out. I've enabled everybody to be able to speak here. Alternatively, feel free to use the Q&A section down there to go ahead and place some questions. There is a pause about halfway through where we can go ahead and answer that. My name is Mike Smith. I'm the CEO of a company called Aclymate, which you can see here on the slides. I'll talk a little bit about that. Good Business Colorado member, and really happy to be here. Really thankful for Deborah and the crowd for hosting this. My background: I used to fly F-18s for the U.S. Navy. I spent about 12 and a half years active duty doing that. And then I had an experience with climate that caused me to decide to change course. I got out of the Navy, started a company called Renew West, which was about planting trees in areas burned by wildfire for climate outcomes. Achieved some success there, planted a couple million trees in Northern California, which is a record. And then, but I wanted to also get into the emissions reduction side of things and to go ahead and help small to medium-sized businesses be part of the solution. Just for context, small to medium-sized businesses in the United States, were they their own country, would be the third largest emitter on the planet. And so that has like a lot of effect there. And I wanted to help folks to engage in a meaningful way with their climate footprint without having to become an expert. So that's kind of the birth of Aclymate. Happy to answer questions about any of it a little bit later. But with no further ado, you should all be able to see my screen. So let's get started. The first thing is it's time to get on the climate bus or get run over. We're going to spend the first few minutes here kind of talking about like why it's important to consider climate change as part of your small business and to some of the early steps that you can do that. I'll pause after that to take a few questions, and then we'll move into some more advanced topics around carbon markets, climate policy, et cetera. And again, anytime, feel free to ask questions. So the first thing of why you should consider about acting on climate is because it's good for your brand. Climate consumers are a growing part of the U.S. population. Specifically, 34% of consumers in the United States are climate aware. They consider climate as a major concern when they're out purchasing goods and services in the economy. More interestingly is that about 23% of them, though, they are climate conscious, where this is their top decision concern. That's a surprising number that most businesses don't actually really internalize, but they should. Moreover, these are the customers you want. On average, they have a 50% higher checking account than the average American. So they have a little bit more discretionary income. They're willing to spend money where it matters. The thing is that these customers, they expect proof. You can't, especially younger generations, they're skeptical of green claims. So you need to make sure that you're backing up what you're claiming there. They're going to want to see that evidence either through some sort of disclosure or through some sort of trusted certification. Climate's also really good for attracting employees. A survey by Cone Communications found that 3 out of 4 millennials would take a pay cut to work for a socially responsible company. 83% of them would be more loyal to a company that engaged in these behaviors, and almost 2/3 of them wouldn't work for a company with poor environmental practices. And millennials, it's worth pointing out, are just entering the peak of their economic and political power. The oldest millennials now are turning 40. And so they're that. And they're not the only ones. Gen Z is just as activated. I like to refer to them collectively as the climate generation. You can also see that even in the least engaged generation, the baby boomers, 21% of them have meaningfully engaged with climate in the last year. Meaningfully engaged means that they've given money to a charity, have written or called a politician about this, or have attended a political event. These are people that are highly activated, and that's 1 out of 5 boomers. So it's all across the space, and this thing's starting to rapidly change. Speaking of which, the market itself is rapidly changing. A lot of this is coming from instead of this bottom-up pressure from employees and consumers, it's also top-down. In Glasgow in 2021, the value of assets committed to a net zero future was 40% of the entire world's wealth. That's about $130 trillion. That's the largest number ever whispered about markets. At the same time, 60% of Fortune 500 companies have set climate-related goals, and so their supply chains are going to increasingly have to get there. Increasingly, especially because the regulators both in the United States and Europe are requiring some of these behaviors to happen. A lot of different standards out there about how they're tracking it. One of the big things of language they talk about is that Scope 3 needs to be tracked for these big public companies. What that really means is Scope 3 for the layperson is that these large companies are going to need to understand the emissions associated with their suppliers and the customers in their supply chain. And they're going to need to enable emissions reductions for those organizations, because that's really the only way that they're going to decarbonize those supply chains. And this is all over the economy. General Motors, not known as a climate stalwart, now requires that all of its suppliers, irrespective of size, track all of their emissions and establish goals to reduce them. Microsoft, totally different industry, goes even further, all emissions, and then it requires you to reduce your emissions by 55% by 2030. So if you want to do business with somebody in Microsoft, you're going to have to do with Microsoft, then you're going to have to do this. Moreover, if you want to do business with somebody that does business with Microsoft, in order for them to track their Scope 3, you're going to have to do this. And so it's time to kind of get ahead of the curve when it comes to climate. So where do you start? That's kind of a tricky thing. The first thing is just get to the starting line. It can be pretty overwhelming to think about all the things that are going on out there. But the first step is just to make a commitment. And so you should do that by evaluating how climate fits into your brand and your company culture. You should also establish what your goals are and the timelines to achieve them. Whether it's decarbonizing just a sector of your operations, or whether it's being actually part of the larger climate solution, and committing to full emissions reductions there. Recognize and strategically, as we just talked about here, being ahead of the curve is probably better than being behind on this one. You need to establish inside of your organization who will be taking the lead and who will be responsible for the outcomes associated with climate. And with all things, identify a budget. It doesn't have to be huge, but there should be a certain amount of money that you're willing to commit to these efforts. Some of that may be for identifying what your emissions are, might be for offsetting. It might be for doing emissions reductions activities, but there should be some budget that you can spend every year in order to get yourself a little bit further down the road here. The next step for any business is, once you're at the starting line, is to get started. And so once you get started, the very first thing you do is to develop a baseline. A baseline is what are your current emissions associated with your business, and how are you going to track and reduce them? So there's 3 kind of options available for the small to medium-sized business. Historically, the one that they go to is some sort of full-service consultancy. I have a favorite, Warm Springs Consulting. Amber Beeg and her crew in Boise are amazing. And so if this is something you're looking for, this is great. Some pros associated with this are You have, knowledgeable people that are doing all the work for you. They have experience in doing this. You really don't have to spend a whole lot of thinking about like how to get started on this. The con is this can be a little bit expensive. And before you're even doing any of the emissions reductions, you've already spent a fair amount of budget, usually in the thousands of dollars. Alternatively, the other alternative that was available to people were some basic online calculators, and you can do some searching there. One of my favorites is Carbon Fund, carbonfund.org. And so in the basic online calculators, you are responsible for identifying what all your emissions related activities are and finding a way to track them, maintaining the information there, and then you plug it into this online calculator and it'll spit out a number for you. And that will typically give you some sort of footprint, usually to enable you to purchase offsets. What it usually doesn't do is to show you with like any fidelity of like where those emissions are coming from, beyond kind of like broad strokes. They don't tell you, it doesn't help you to visualize how to reduce them. It just gives you mostly like a top line number. For some people that may be sufficient. And so if you're one of those, like Carbon Fund's a great place for you to start. But then there's emerging class of carbon accounting tools. Aclymate is one of them. That's what you're seeing here to the right on your screen. And I'm happy to give a demo to people if they'd like as we go through this. And so these climate accounting tools are for different users, all the way from the individual up to the enterprise level, large corporate. And when you think about the emissions calculations associated with that, your knowledge level and expertise matters. And so the service that you choose is going to be based upon your budget, size of your organization, and your degree of expertise, or the person that's operating it and what they're going to be doing. Aclymate was built with a small to medium-sized business explicitly in mind. We are solely targeted at US SMBs. And so I'd recommend that to anybody that's in that space to think about us for that. One of the things that Aclymate does, or any good accounting tool does, is it should help you to analyze emissions by different sources. It should help you to identify it by employee. So knowing which employee is causing the most emissions, you should be able to look at it by facility and more. It should also integrate with the data sources you already have in order to reduce the requirement for data collection on your part, so you can go ahead and automate that. After you develop that baseline, though, you need to make a plan about to make those emissions reductions. And so what you need to work on there is to identify where your emissions are coming from, and don't just make assumptions. Those assumptions can be pretty tempting, but sometimes they're pretty wrong. One of our customers, for example, assumed that they fly people in from all over the world for localized training. It's a pretty essential core part of their business. They thought that that would be their biggest emissions source. And it wasn't small by any stretch, but actually their biggest emission was commuting. And specifically, they had a couple of employees that really were disproportionately causing that commuting emissions to go up. Folks that were commuting by, pickup truck for like 40 miles each direction. And so challenging your assumptions through data is an important part of what you're going to want to do. There's increasing pressure here to do more than just offset. And so offsetting is important. We'll talk about that in a minute here, but like the emissions reductions is where people are going to give you the benefit of the doubt that if you're doing that work of cutting your emissions, and it doesn't have to be 100% next week, a little bit each year, that they're going to believe you and they're going to trust you, and they're going to see that you're walking the right path here. More importantly, it's critical to our climate goals. We won't be able to get to, we can't offset our way out of the problem. Offsets are important to that, but we have to figure out ways to start reducing emissions in big ways. Here are a couple of typical first steps for companies to reduce their emissions. One is to look at purchasing renewable electricity. Whatever utility provider you're working with, usually they have some sort of green or renewable energy option. It's a fairly low cost way to go ahead and to get started. It's a pretty simple step for you to think about there. Another thing to think about here is remote work structures. So we're obviously all kind of living in this post pandemic world here, but so we've become familiar with hybrid or remote work. You don't have to work 100% remote. Remember that this isn't an either or, it's a both sort of scenario. And so if you can go to working remotely half the time, where before you weren't working remotely at all, like that can be a pretty significant emissions reductions. And you should consider that, vis-a-vis your employees' commuting behaviors. Obviously, minimizing flight impacts is a pretty big one there. We're communicating today over a video teleconference, and that is an increasing way that business is done. That said, I'm a human. I recognize that talking face to face with people sometimes are like really important. And so when available, if you can drive, especially if there's more than one person going, like then that's a little bit better, or even better than that is a train. But when it's not available and you have to fly, even if it may be cheaper to do a layover, do the direct flight. There's a lot of emissions associated with each takeoff and landing. And so just doing the direct flight and thinking about that can significantly reduce your input. And then, from an employer standpoint, start thinking about employee green commuting incentives, whether that's helping them to purchase mass transit tickets, start to look at potential carpooling. These are really early and fairly easy first steps. Kind of the next step in the path for you, though, is that you should consider offsetting. People tend to think of it as an either or, that you should either reduce your emissions or you should offset. Well, you actually need to do both. And there's been a lot of noise out there in the press about what's going on there, but it's that offsets are still a good thing, even if it's maybe not quite as good as you would have initially believed. The first thing is that about offsetting is at a minimum, it creates an internal price on emissions. And so it becomes a little bit more of a dollars and cents questions. For example, if that flight is $30 more expensive to go direct than it is to take that layover, but it would have cost you $40 in offsets, well, then that becomes a dollars and cents question. Alternatively, if it would have cost you $20 in offsets, it makes it a little bit closer and it helps you to think a little bit more about your impact. Often offsets have co-benefits that really align with your values and with your brand. And so as that first part there, when you think about like how this is going to be part of your brand and part of your company, telling those offsets have a lot of these co-benefits around, whether it's, regeneration of nature or preservation of it, whether it's keeping money in your local economy, whether it is, broader climate justice issues about sending, money into the developing world, the global South, or towards indigenous communities. Like there's a lot of advantages to that. And so it's worth considering there. And frankly, there's no pathway to our climate future without there being some sort of monetary transfer from those that are causing the damage to those that can kind of start repairing it or reducing it. Carbon offsets, there's even though they try to make them very objective, there is a bit of subjectivity to them here. It's very rare though where an offset is totally worthless. And there's occasions there where an offset is actually more valuable. And I could give you some stories about like what that would look like. So think about that. Big picture for those of you that aren't kind of in the know, if you're looking to buy offsets, I would start with Gold Standard and Climate Action Reserve. They're the two best registries, in my opinion, for additionality concerns and kind of having the most stringent subjectivity associated with what qualifies. And then I would look at American Carbon Registry and Vera as the next two. There's quite a few that are kind of in the developing and new space. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but unless you develop a degree of expertise, you're probably not going to be able to interact with them in a way where you could actually discern that directly. So I would start with the registries like that. Finally, share your efforts. You should be loud about the work that you're doing on climate. One, there's a reason you're doing this. It's good for your brand and for employee satisfaction. But more importantly, actually, is that like just telling people that this is something that you do and you care about has a subtle and important effect upon them. We all want to keep up with the Joneses, and if you're a leader on this, they're going to want to follow. And you don't have to be, proselytizing about it. Like you can just talk about like, hey, this is something that we do because we care about it and it's important to us and it has these effects. And people will start to think about like maybe they need to change their behavior. You should include this in your social media, website, and other marketing materials. It is part of your brand, and you should recognize that. And often this includes some sort of broader release associated with blog posts and or press releases, and so consider that. but you should also be very specific about like what you're doing. Because again, people have a little bit of a skepticism towards like a greenwashing thing. And so the more details that you provide about what you're doing, if you're doing offsets, what offset project you're supporting and why, talking about like the customers that you're working with that care about it, or the employees that care about it, like the more you give, voice, the more important that becomes there. Be careful about certifications. So at Aclymate, we do have a certification, as you see here. And so there's either two ways the certification works. Is one, either it's from a brand that everybody knows and trusts. Right now, there's not one very well established in the space. Or it's one that makes what you're doing a little bit more transparent. One of the things we pride ourselves on at Aclymate is that by getting our certification, it's actually a widget that lives on your website, or a QR code if it's in printed material, that can take you to, essentially, you get your free sustainability page associated with an Aclymate account. And so people can actually see what you're doing. You don't have to tell them. They just look at it and they can improve it to themselves. So that's kind of the down and the dirty about like what it is, how to get started on in climate accounting, or getting your business moving that path towards net zero. So I'll go ahead and take a pause here for any questions. So I have a question from Deborah here, which is that what software does Aclymate integrate with? So right now we integrate with QuickBooks, and we are going to be expanding in the next month or so into pretty much every accounting solution that is available to small to medium-sized businesses. This is important because what our software does is it sorts through all of your expense-related information, identifies emissions-related activities, does a calculation for them, and then where available, we actually prompt you to like tag employees, to maybe give us a little bit more precision on the calculations associated with that. And it allows us to really reduce the work of how we do the climate accounting and to give the details associated with it. We're also integrated with Utility API. So if you have a relationship with your utility company, such as not through like it's not included in the lease, but you actually pay a bill, we can connect to that meter, and we can go ahead and pull that information in and automate it. And so for Excel, that includes both natural gas and electricity. And so we can pretty much put all this stuff on autopilot for you. If you're not within our current service area coverages, which is a good chunk of the United States, we're actually going to be expanding out that direction as well. So those integrations are coming quick. Are there any other questions? Yeah, sure, Deborah. So I can go ahead and show a few offset projects that we do offer here. Oops, there we are. So what everybody can see on our screen, on the screen here, is a demo of the software that we have here. And so you can see, in pretty full color, like where your emissions are coming from, whether it's from utilities or vehicle mileage or employee commuting or travel. You have the ability to look at it there. We send out surveys so you can see various employee related emissions. You can look at a historical of what the emissions are. So the average emissions for this employee, me in this case, and then like, a big hump associated with travel for that. So that's how that works. But once you get all of your calculation there, you can see that we have emissions tracking every month. And then we have the ability for you to go ahead and purchase offsets. If you don't know which offsets to buy, we actually have a quiz here that will ask you, what do you care about? Whether it's location, price, social justice issues, etc. And so you go through that survey, and then we'll display it to you in your order of preference there, so you can rank them as appropriate. Projects are kind of all over the world. There's 54 on the demo site, but there's 101, I believe, on the live site. And you can click and look at various projects. You read about the project there. You can see some of the pictures of it. You can read the story of that project. You can see the associated sustainable development goals from the UN there, and you can even go learn about what those are. And the external verification documents. I particularly like May Ranch there because it's a climate action reserve as well. Quick value of how many offsets you want to purchase there. You can set it by volume or even by a future climate leader date. But offsets are kind of all over. We have biodiversity, we have forestry projects, agriculture, biomass, energy efficiency, infrastructure, emissions capture, you name it, we're there. And like I said, all over the world, I believe on 6 continents. So lots of opportunity for that. And I'm happy to give anybody like a more personalized recommendation if that would make sense. Any other questions? Okay, moving forward. So this is the big picture. This is what emissions are year on year. This is not cumulative. This is like what the annual emissions are, as you see up here. So it's worth pointing out that since 1990, more than half of all human emissions in all of human history have occurred. So carve it to like right here. This slice of the pie is bigger than that slice, going back to the beginning of humanity. That's a big thing. You can also see that like this breaks down into some fairly big emitters: Europe, the United States. China's kind of the boogeyman for a lot of people, but and they are the #1 emitter in the world currently. Historically, that's not the case though, and by per capita, not the case either. India, another kind of boogeyman that people are going after, relatively small, even with their billion+ people. What does that look like? Well, that actually means that the emissions in the atmosphere are accumulating. Natural systems have the ability to scrub some of this out, but they're not being able to keep up. If you look at the slope of this curve, it's actually not only going up, but it's getting steeper as it goes, which means that for the last 30 years, effectively, we've not only been like heading towards the rocks, we've been accelerating towards them. So it's a big thing to think about. That kind of is setting us down a few paths. Known as RCPs, or relative concentration pathways. They're all warmer than where we grew up. It's worth pointing out the world that we grew up in will never return. And so right now it's a question of between bad and apocalypse, like bad catastrophe, cataclysm, apocalypse. Like it's really kind of nasty stuff. And so that can be pretty intimidating. So this is the hard place that we're heading. But at the same time, we're also kind of stuck on a rock here, which is the global population is both growing and entering the middle class. And as they do that, they consume more energy. One of my favorite numbers here is that the average American refrigerator consumes more electricity per year than the average 3 Nigerian people in their entire lives. So there's a lot of electricity, a lot of energy, and saying Nigerians aren't allowed to have refrigerators is not really the answer. And so we're going to have to figure some stuff out here. So this is the consequences of that rock in the hard place. India, like I said, has not like historically been one of the biggest causers of the problem we have there, and they're growing kind of into that middle class. But they also have this huge population that needs to consider this. So this is not just India; it's also Pakistan and Bangladesh. In it's an area that constitutes about 1.75 billion people. And according to this paper, in a warming world, a 4.5 scenario looks quite a bit warmer here, and an 8.5 scenario even warmer. And you'll notice a lot of that warming also happens to occur where people in the Indian subcontinent live. It's where a lot of the economics are generated. It's also where a lot of their agriculture. That creates projected outcomes where extreme heat for this population goes from 15 to 75% of the population every year. Extreme heat is the sort of thing that like you really can't do any meaningful work outside. You have to sit in the shade and drink water. And that goes from covering a population of 260 million to about 1.3 billion people. It also enters a new language thing into our language, which is fatal heat, which is it doesn't matter how much water or fan you have blowing on you, you will die without air conditioning. where the dew point is so high that perspiration actually can't cool you off. That goes to 4% of the population in an 8.5 scenario. That means 70 million people. There's some really catastrophic effects that come from that. If you've ever read the book or Ministry for the Future, essentially the first 5 chapters kind of describe what that scenario would look like. It's grim. And so if you think about that, like India and Pakistan are both nuclear armed states. They border a third nuclear state, which is China. All of them having their own population issue or their own climate issues. Bangladesh is, one of the areas most likely to flood as sea levels rise. And so where do these people go is going to have a lot of things there. So choosing which pathway we're going down is really, really important. At Paris in 2015 at COP21, they set a goal there that we're going to be looking for a maximum of 2 degrees warming or 1.5 C. Well, what does that mean? It means that, the major sectors of emissions, energy, industry, buildings, transport, food, and our effects upon nature, the negative effects need to be decreased and the positive effects need to be increased. In a real sense, this means that we all need to cut, if we're to be on this pathway together, we all need to cut our emissions by about 50% by 2030. And we need to cut another 50% of that in the next decade, and then another 50% of that. Essentially, we need to get to about a 90% emissions reductions over that time, and we need to be increasing our ability to capture carbon from the atmosphere, either through nature or through technical means, probably almost essentially both. This starts looking a lot like what they call donut theory economics, which is that there's a social foundation on which everybody needs to live, and then there's an ecological ceiling and under which everybody needs to live. They're actually fairly interrelated. The more that you give people security, the less likely they are to make short-term disastrously bad environmental decisions, and they're to invest in their health and safety. And so it's important to not frame this as an either or, but as a both. So donut economics is important, and we're largely not succeeding on either the social foundation or the ecological ceiling, most notably biodiversity loss and climate change, but not exclusively. You may think about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them, and they roughly map to this, which is about the first 2/3 are about that social foundation, and the last third are close to around that ecological ceiling. But you can see like responsible consumption and production about how that kind of interacts with both. Now, some basics about carbon accounting that you may or may not have heard, but just as a bit of education here, which is climate change is happening because we're emitting a lot of greenhouse gases. And greenhouse gases include 6 different categories, things like methane or industrial gases or refrigerants, or the granddaddy of them all, which is carbon dioxide. Some of them don't even have carbon in them, but because they're all baselined to being an equivalent of carbon dioxide, they become labeled carbon emissions. The standard unit of measurement for them is metric tons of CO2 or its equivalent, which is often referred to, which is technically referred to as a TCO2e. And if that makes your eyes roll back, that's okay. Because really everybody just calls them a ton of carbon, even though it may be 1/25th of a ton of methane, or it may not have any carbon in it at all, like it's an equivalent of the amount of nitrous oxide. And so just understanding that a ton of carbon is a placeholder for all of these gases and all the ways that we interact with them. Generally, though, we need to focus on carbon dioxide and to a large extent, but not quite as large, methane. You may heard people talk about emissions scope. And so what is the first thing is that emission scope is language that was created for large companies to kind of shift responsibility for certain things to other people and to say this is in boundary and this is out of the boundary. Anymore, that's not happening anymore. People aren't allowing you to say, no, this is outside of your responsibility, but it is a useful framework for those large organizations. And it's useful for you to know kind of in a broad sense in case you have to report to them, like what your activities are. Scope 1 emissions are the ones that you're directly responsible for. This includes like leaks from refrigerators that you operate, the fuel that you burn in company vehicles, et cetera. Scope 2 is consumed energy, but you're not doing the emitting. Typically, this looks like electricity, but it also could if you have like a steam heat. Sitting here in my office in Denver, I know I'm pulling some power out of the Comanche power station that Excel runs. That would be Excel's scope 1 emission because they're the burning the coal. That'd be my scope 2. And then scope 3 is everything else. There's 15 categories here and includes things like corporate travel, employee commuting, shipping, and ultimately the use of your product. And so this is how, like, you may have heard like that 71% of the world's emissions come from 100 companies. Well, that's because like some of these companies, their product is the fuel that we all consume. And so while that's a correct number, and they bear responsibility for it, it's also worth remembering like that it's a shared responsibility, because you're also making the decision to use that fuel for your operations. The last thing to think about here are different types of carbon offsets. And like I said, there's been a lot of noise in this space about like what an offset, what qualifies as a good offset versus what it isn't. I'm not going to weigh into that too heavily here, because there's a lot of opinion about that. But what I will say is that they roughly fall into kind of 2 buckets. The first being the ones that are associated with avoided emissions, like livestock methane or renewable energy. And this is where you're paying somebody that would have emitted to reduce their emissions. And that might feel a little bit icky, because like, why should they get to emit? But at the end of the day, like they are emitting, and frankly, you are emitting too. Like if you're using electricity or burning fuel in a vehicle, and so you have permission to emit too, right? And so if we can create financial incentives to change that behavior, all the better. It's worth pointing out that when the law changes, this goes away. It doesn't continue. And so if this feels icky, advocate for legal changes that would be associated with that. It's also worth pointing out that like it's really important to do some of these things. Methane, for example, only gets credited about at a 25-to-1 ratio for carbon dioxide, based upon its potential for warming the climate over 100 years. But actually, if you measure methane over the next 20 years, it's like 85 times as bad. Effectively, buying 1 ton of methane reduction equivalent is worth about 4 tons in the next 20 years. So it's actually kind of a bargain, and it's a really important part of like our climate pathway. On the other side of the equation, there are carbon removals. My background was in forestry, as I mentioned earlier, in planting trees. And so like this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I planted a couple million trees in California, and I'll always care about it. There's also direct air capture, technological means, and other ways where you capture the carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere. This has a little bit more of an intellectually pure argument about like, I pollute, somebody else captures it and stores it and pulls it out of the atmosphere. And so that's really valuable. And then there's some that kind of blend, whether it's preserving a forest that's under threat from being cut down, but then managing it so it increases its carbon uptake rate, is both like an avoided emission from the cutting and then also a removal associated with its future growth. And so I wouldn't get too worked up about it here. What I would say is find the project that makes the most sense to you and is valuable for your planning goals there. Now, how do carbon offsets work? Well, they exist on registries. As I mentioned before, there's 4 registries that are broadly known there: American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, Gold Standard, and Verra. The middle 2 being my favorite 2. These organizations are nonprofits, and their job is to both to create the ledger on which everything is accounted, and then to create the protocols and methodologies in which a project developer can go out and develop a carbon offset project. Those methodologies and protocols have to go through peer review and their own internal review processes. They're publicly displayed. You can go read any one of them right now associated with that. And so they're the ones that say what counts as an offset, and then who owns the offset, and then ultimately when the offset has been retired in order to avoid double counting. And it creates a marketplace that kind of looks like this, a market that comes in 3 parts: project developers, middlemen, brokers, and retailers, and ultimately the end consumer. Project developers must adhere to those methodologies, and then they need to go ahead and go out and source the funding, find the projects, develop the project. Then they have to have a third-party auditor come out and verify that, or validate what they're doing is what they say they're doing, and then another third party come out and verify that like they have done what they say they were going to do. And only at that point are they then issued offsets. Most offsets are known as ex post, which means they have to do the work before they get the offset, but they have to register the project before they do the work. And so there's that. Any concerns you have around natural systems, while fairly well founded, are also have been thought about. Like there are insurance pools to make sure that we're overproducing offsets relative to the risk of that natural system being damaged or lost. Some players in the space there. My former company, Renew West, a new finite carbon, are fairly well recognized there. You also have project brokers who historically the developers were so focused on the project and they didn't have like a lot of direct relationships with the ultimate end buyers, though they could happen. So typically it was this broker relationship where the broker would facilitate the transaction just like a real estate agent would, and then they would take a percentage of the deal. Well-known players in that space, BGC, Aclymate, 3 Degrees are there. It's worth pointing out that Aclymate is a partner of Aclimate's. And then ultimately there's these end buyers who either have to do it because they have like a regulatory requirement or they're doing it for voluntary reasons. And so that could be Alaska Airlines, who's doing it because they have to comply with like a UN requirement, Microsoft, who's doing it for a voluntary reason, but really it's actually because their investors are requiring it, for Shell, who has to do it for compliance in the California market. They're doing it for voluntary stuff in order to sell to airlines and for their own goals. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And so that's how the markets historically worked. That's starting to kind of break down a little bit. As things are changing here, you have like a new actually is both a broker and a developer now. Aclymate is moving upstream as well in order to be able to do its brokering to secure its own supply. And then you have companies like who, if you're looking to become an offset buyer, you're not one of those big corporates down there. So you have a different need for like who you interact with to purchase your offsets. And so like Aclymate kind of sits in within the project brokerage space as well, in addition to being the service provider that helps you calculate your footprint. A couple things about Aclymate here that I'm proud about. It's a solution that our customers want. Laura here's runs a regional bank's investor relations. And she found us to be like a simple and affordable way to measure their emissions and how to take action. On the total other end of the spectrum, you have Dylan here, who runs a company called Highland Outdoors. Highland Outdoors is a small print publication out of West Virginia that talks about the outdoors, as you'd imagine. There's only 2 employees, and they found us to be the right solution for them as well. A couple things I would say about like us here at Aclymate. We've been built from the ground up for the SMB customer. We understand that problem best because we're obsessed with that problem. I used to be an advisor to the U.S. Climate Alliance. I also planted a couple million trees, so I've developed some real expertise in climate and carbon policy. And as a result, like we're the only company that I've seen that actually has that in the C-suite. And then I mentioned before that we have a partnership with Aclymate. We are they're a very highly regarded broker within this space. And we're their exclusive small business retailer. So if you're looking for a specific type of offset, we're your huckleberry. Things we can do to help. We have a Climate Navigator program that provides dedicated customer support. It's very simple pricing, $1 per employee per month. If you need concierge services, those are available as well. Industry leading selection. Literally, you can't find more selection of offsets anywhere on the web. We have that partnership with Aclymate as well. And you have the potential to earn our Climate Leader certification. So that's it. Again, I'm happy to answer questions, talk about carbon markets more broadly, climate policies, and I thank you for paying attention to this point. Melissa, do you have any questions? Okay, so from Christopher, and by the way, you guys all have the ability to use your voice here too. You don't have to type it in the Q&A. So Christopher asked, are your clients typically also members of 1% for the Planet? What's the relationship look like between Aclymate and that organization? So I would say we're friends is the relationship, but we're not business partners. So 1% for the planet has a very laudable goal here, which is that you should donate 1% of your business operations towards climate or towards environmental nonprofits in order to generate revenue there. I think that is a good thing to do. I think like it's like an unalloyed good thing. I also think that that kind of elides like taking like the real responsibility of figuring out how to decarbonize your own operations and how to kind of like start to work on that part of the footprint. So effectively like paying that 1% in order to do that has collective benefit, and like that's unavoidable there, and it's an important part of like doing that. But I wouldn't think of us as competition, but as like a more of like an enabling feature to actually start making that impact there. So does that answer your question, Kristen?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I was just I've been thinking about becoming a member of 1% for the planet. I also like what you're showing here, and so I'm just trying to understand which path to follow and what that might look like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to talk with you at length, and if you go with 1% or both, like then that's great. I'm like I said, I'm supportive of what they're doing. Would you like me to kind of follow up with you directly about that?
Yeah, we can follow up. I can reach out to you as well.
Okay, thanks, man. All right, so I got a question here from Melissa. It's maybe too specific, but do you see progress in terms of lowering CO2 for the food industry? Energy Star will not give a rating to any bakery or food manufacturers. How would a food production space work on lowering their CO2e? So that's a great question. And as with most answers in the world, the answer is it depends. Some organizations are doing a great job. Other organizations are not. Within the food industry, there's it's hard to generalize here, but like if I were, what I would say is that you have a lot of emissions associated with the production of food, and so where you source your energy matters. An example there is that if you're sourcing from natural gas in order to run baking, for example, to run the ovens, that may be the most efficient from a dollar standpoint, but it's almost certainly not the most efficient from a carbon standpoint. And so the electric industry is one of the areas of the world that's like decarbonizing the most rapidly. And so frankly, by just electrifying everything as best you can, you get to take advantage of what they're doing for decarbonization. There's also some pretty turnkey solutions that if you just want to buy renewable electricity right now, you can. And so we can help with that if that makes sense. The other part about like where food comes from is about like your sourcing. And so that gets to be a little bit harder to display. Historically, that's been done through some sort of like life cycle analysis of the embodied carbon in the food products that you're buying. And so we can help a little bit with that. It's worth considering though that like people tend to think that like the emissions are from if they source locally. But there's pretty good research out there that like the bigger thing is not about like where you source from, but what you are sourcing. So specifically, like if you're doing a lot of meat related activities, there's about 40 pounds of grain that have to go into turning 1 pound of beef. If you source that locally versus a pound of grain from the other side of the planet, it's far and away better to do the grain. And so just thinking about like what the blend is within your food is important. So follow-up question to that, it looks like Melissa is a problem is most bakeries don't have enough power to run electric oven, and cities are unwilling to increase the transformers where you get power from, so you have no choice but to run natural gas ovens. So that is absolutely kind of a complex issue. And so that is a complex issue. I don't have the total solution for you on that one. So just something to consider there. But I'd be happy to kind of explore the question with you, kind of maybe in more detail, if that would be something you'd be interested in. Okay, and then Deborah wants me to talk about like if it would what it would look like to onboard. So the first thing is that onboarding, we provide somebody to help you with the onboarding process. This shouldn't be scary. Travis, he's my little ray of sunshine. Like the guy is like the nicest person on the planet. And he loves solving problems. And so that's what he does. During onboarding, we ask you a few questions about like, where do you work? What industry you're in? How many employees do you have? Et cetera. And so the component of like, where do you work? We'll ask you like, what are the different offices, the addresses, what's the square footage associated with that? What's their relationship to the utility? Are the utilities included in the lease? If they aren't, do you pay them together like an Excel, or do you pay them separately? If they are within a region that we have, we'll offer you the integration to go ahead and be able to pull that information in directly. And so to make that really pretty quick and painless there. We'll also ask you, what accounting systems that you use. And so you can either integrate with QuickBooks. It's just as quick as having a login, kind of a standard way that we all do it on the internet out these days. And our QuickBooks account will, our software will go ahead and sort through and identify all of your emissions related activities, whether it's associated bills, commuting, etc. If you don't use QuickBooks and you onboard within the next month before we bring in the other accounting solutions, at a minimum, you can also like upload a financial a list of all of your expenses, and we'll do the same kind of sorting activity associated with that. We also have the ability for you to add single emissions, so things that don't show up on your accounting, whether it's, for example, if you bought a flight using credit card miles or something like that. Then you can go ahead and manually input those here across all the various different emissions related activities. Finally, we ask you to provide us with a list of all of your employees. You can either type them in or just upload a spreadsheet of them, and then we'll send them all a survey. And it takes them 3 minutes to do things that they pretty much already know, what they're doing. Where do they work? How do they get there? How often do they go? And we have the ability to kind of track, different commuting methods, different commuting locations. For example, if you're working at home, et cetera. And this is something that they can all change, and it's done very, very quickly. In the very near future, here in about a month, we're also going to be releasing an individual employee portal, effectively, where they can track their own home emissions and kind of see the overlap with where they do it at work. And they can start to make that can help to empower them to start making smarter decisions as well. If you come with the material that Travis helps you to know that you need to show up, it takes you about 15-20 minutes to onboard. It's pretty simple. Alternatively, if you don't want to deal with Travis, I would recommend you do, because he's awesome. But if you don't like talking to people so much, then the software will guide you through the onboarding process as well. For most people, they find it to be a pretty obvious and simple experience. The other thing that I would mention here is that for those folks that are that sign up with us through GBC, we do offer a discount on your first purchase of offsets, 20% discount there. So you can kind of get started on that process and know that like you're making that impact like kind of right away. And we just are extending that only to our GBC brethren here. Berenice, any questions?
Yeah, do you offer this service in Spanish?
I actually have an incredibly multilingual team. And so within the team, I think we speak 10 different languages. Including a couple of fluent Spanish speakers. So we can absolutely, in the short term, help you with kind of Spanish onboarding, et cetera. In the development roadmap is to make this multilingual across those 10 different languages, starting with Spanish for obvious reasons. And so would love to, frankly, if you're interested in doing this, I'd love to kind of like have your input as we build that.
Yeah, because I work with Latino businesses and they have participated in Boulder County programming and they are not tracking, their metrics. So it would be great that there is an easy way for them to just input easily and in automatic get a report. So then they can tell their clients that they are green, helping the planet, something like that. Yeah, let's follow up offline.
Okay, absolutely. If you registered with through the link before, I should have your email.
Yes, I can also ask Deborah to connect us.
Okay, very good. Christopher, Deborah, Melissa, any other questions?
No, you're very knowledgeable, Mike. Thank you so much.
I get to be professionally opinionated.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think you did a really, really great job with delivering a lot of educational content and really lifting up how cool Aclymate is.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you.
this is just the beginning. And yeah, Bernice has done an incredible job with like bringing stuff to the Spanish speaking business owner community. So that'd be a really great partnership that we'd love to support in pursuing too.
Yeah, that'd be phenomenal. Yeah, it was on our pathway and I'd love to get started on it. So, Melissa, anything for you?
No, I thank you very much for your time. This was very interesting. It gives me lots to think about as we move forward in reducing our carbon emissions without the city helping and blocking us. So I'm just going to do my own thing. Thank you.
Okay, well, very good. I'd love to help you if we can there. If that makes sense, I'd love to follow up with you.
No, thank you very much. I've got your info. So definitely.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you again, everybody, for your time and for tuning in. And then if you could share, what we're doing here at Aclymate with your colleagues, friends, and family, that would mean the world to me. So thank you again. And I hope you all have a great weekend.